Today on the Roundhouse, we're learning more about the Allegheny Portage Railroad. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 142 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. The Roundhouse podcast is a Streamliner Media production, my company where I use digital storytelling, especially video, to help your business or nonprofit reach its goals. If you want to learn more, go to streamlinermedia.com. Today, we're talking about the Allegheny Portage Railroad, which just this month, as of March 2024, turned 190 years old. Specifically, we'll be speaking with Park Ranger Elizabeth Shope about the history of this railroad and the National Park Service's involvement in preserving that history. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse podcast on Patreon, including our most recent supporters, White Oak Rail, Polar 5648, T-Crash, Vincent, and Brett. If you go to patreon.com/theroundhouse, for as little as $1 a month, you're going to be supporting the show and what we do here. And there's perks, including early access to episodes of the podcast. I appreciate those of you who are supporting the podcast. Let's learn more about the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Our guest today is a park ranger who is involved with the interpretation of the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mrs. Elizabeth Shope.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me today.
It is so great to have you on. It's been a while since we've covered something within the national park sphere. Some years back, we covered Steamtown, but this goes way, way back to the early days of railroading. So perhaps, as a good starting point, you could provide an overview of what the Allegheny Portage Railroad was.
So the Allegheny Portage Railroad was one piece of the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal, which went from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. It was almost 400 miles across the state, built by the state of Pennsylvania. And this was the final piece of the Mainline Canal. And the Allegheny Portage Railroad helped to solve the problem of how to get over the Allegheny Mountains in the 1830s, when railroads were very much in their infancy in the United States at that time.
What led to the railroad's construction?
So for the Mainline Canal as a whole, in New York State, you have the Erie Canal, and the port city of Philadelphia is being bypassed because it takes about 3 weeks to get through Pennsylvania by wagon. And the state came up with the idea of the Mainline Canal of Public Works as a way to be able to move people and goods across the state faster. And for the piece of the Allegheny Portage Railroad itself, how do we get over the barrier that is the Allegheny Mountains? And a railroad was not the state's first or preferred method. Canals were the preferred method of travel at that time. And one idea was to actually have a canal go through the mountains, but one estimate said it could take up to 30 years to build. And there is a little bit of a sense of urgency because other areas, other parts of the Mainline Canal are ready to open, and this is the final piece. They also thought about a road over the Allegheny Mountains. There was the Northern Turnpike Road, but you can only fit so many people in a wagon, so many goods. So the state came up with a 36-mile railroad that would connect a canal basin in Hollidaysburg on the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains, with a canal basin in Johnstown on the western side. And to make it work, they used a series of 10 inclined planes that sort of served as steps, 5 on each side of the mountain. And that's how they made it work.
My understanding is that this was part of something called the Pennsylvania Main Line, and that it did have heavy state involvement. So was the state the owner of this railroad then once it was constructed, or were they just a principal financer of it?
Yeah, so they built and funded the mainline canal. Yeah, so it was a state-run operation.
Describe some of the machinery that was required in order to lift passenger cars, freight cars, and even flat cars carrying sectional canal boats over the mountains.
So because locomotives didn't have enough power to go up over the Allegheny Mountains themselves, they used a series of 10 inclined planes. And at the top of each of the 10 inclined planes was an engine house structure. And inside of the engine house was all of the machinery used to pull everything up those steep inclines. They varied in length, but at the bottom of each incline plane, you hooked up to a continuous hemp rope, and there was a stationary engine inside of the engine house building. And the stationary engine and the rope pulls everything up the incline planes. It's only going a few miles per hour. And, I always say when I think of the incline planes and their operation, to say that this is an idea to be able to pull things up over the Allegheny Mountains, but to actually build it, incorporate it, and make it work during its time is absolutely amazing.
We'll get into this more later, but from a lot of the signage and language that I saw at the site, there's definitely an emphasis on the technological marvel of this, because I think that it's so easy when we look at technological advances of the past to see them as antiquated. It's really hard to get in the mindset of this was cutting edge. This was a revolutionary idea or system.
It was, when people traveled on this system, they had never been on anything like this before. People didn't know what to expect. So when we start talking about the traveler's experience, they're meeting up and talking with other people, and that is really going to give them an idea of what to expect on the next part of their journey. So this was something totally new for people. And, talking about advancements, the Industrial Revolution is taking place at the same time, and just with travel times as well. Prior to the mainline canal, it took about 3 weeks to get across the state by wagon, and now it takes an average of 5 days. So this was really the fast new way to travel, and people were very excited about this new way to travel.
Part of the technological growth of it as well, on one side you have the fact that initially it started with horse-drawn operation on the plateaus, on the flatter plains between the incline planes. Then steam locomotive comes along, and that provides a much more efficient means of getting cars from one plane to another. But also the switch from hemp rope to wire rope and its connection to the Brooklyn Bridge. That fascinated me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So John Roebling first tested out um, his wire rope on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and he did a demonstration on incline plane number 3. And the state allowed him to demonstrate. The state allowed him to give a demonstration, and he picked incline plane number 3 because that was the shortest of the 10. And by the 1840s, it would replace all of the hemp rope on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And John Roebling definitely made the Allegheny Portage Railroad much safer. There were a lot of accidents caused by the hemp ropes breaking. They're pulling many train cars up the incline planes. So, Sometimes the ropes only lasted one season. They had to be taken up and stored in the winter, constant repairs. So it was quite a dangerous place to work. And John Roebling definitely made Allegheny Portage Railroad operations a lot safer.
The safety of it, that is something that, yeah, having that much heavy metal on that steep a grade with something that could break is scary. One of the things I saw at the site was this sled that would be towed behind railroad cars that would drop down if the tension eased up to try to stop them. But it seems like there were still issues with the occasional runaway and accidents that could injure or kill people.
The safety car was attached to the last car going up the incline plane. And you're exactly right. The idea was that if those ropes broke, the car would go up onto the safety car and that would act as a brake. It certainly it helped, but sometimes, you know, we're in a hurry with our day-to-day operations and maybe we don't hook up that safety car, or maybe there's a lot of weight in those train cars, so they're going to go right up and over the safety car. But that was definitely another important safety feature that was incorporated on the Allegheny Portage Railroad.
Some of the knowledge that we have about the use and the conditions of the railroad come from news accounts, and others come from first person accounts. It seems like there were some famous passengers that you had on the railroad at that time.
There were Charles Dickens, perhaps the most famous traveler on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. He traveled on the railroad in 1842 during his first trip to America. And he wrote about not only his travels on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, but all of his adventures in America in a book called American Notes for General Circulation. And he described the Allegheny Portage Railroad by saying that the rails were laid upon the extreme verge of a giddy precipice. And he also describes the scenery. Ulysses S. Grant traveled on the Allegheny Portage Railroad on his way to West Point, and he said that they were traveling so fast on the level sections of the railroad that he said it was like annihilating space. So when you think about going, top speeds of about 15 miles per hour, seems very slow to us today, but back then, if you've never ridden on a system like this, it really would have seemed very fast. And a couple years ago, I was outside doing a program and I met a family who had a travel account from one of their ancestors that rode on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And she wrote that she couldn't make out the individual trees that they were passing by. She said it was like they all blurred together. So I thought that that was a nice account to go along with what Ulysses S. Grant was saying.
It's great to have those because then it does contextualize how revolutionary it was at the time for people of that age. What are some of the other interesting points of history or anecdotes that have come out regarding the operation or experience of the railroad?
I think on the Portage Railroad, taverns would have been a welcome sight for travelers, and it would have been an interesting place to catch up on the news of the day. I always think about the perspective of the traveler and again, not really knowing what to expect. But then stopping off in a tavern and meeting other people, maybe I'm traveling to Johnstown and you're heading towards Hollidaysburg. So you can tell me what it was like to go through the Staple Bend Tunnel, which was the first railroad tunnel in America. It was 901 feet of darkness, and traveling on the Portage Railroad was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. And when they were building the Staple Bend Tunnel, they referred to it as a horizontal well because there were a few tunnels that were built for canal purposes, but this was the first one that was built for the railroad. So I really enjoy reading about the traveler's experience, what it was like to ride in those cramped quarters with people that you didn't know for days and days on end.
You mentioned taverns there, and one of the key elements of the site is the Lemon House. What is the history of that building?
Yeah, so the Lemon House Tavern was built by Samuel and Jean Lemon. It would have been built and ready to serve travelers when the Allegheny Portage Railroad opened in March of 1834. The Lemons just happened to be in the right place at the right time. They had a structure that sat along the Northern Turnpike route, very close to the route of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And they're talking about mapping out the route of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So the Lemons buy property on the summit and build their stone tavern. Um, so it operated as a tavern serving both train travelers and folks traveling by wagon. And then it's used by the family. It was a boarding house for a while, so different locals would have lived in the building throughout the years. And when Allegheny Portage Railroad became part of the National Park Service in 1964, this was the only building on site. So the Lemon House actually served as the visitor center for the site until our current visitor center opened in 1992. And then because the Lemon House being the only building here, it had exhibits inside. And once those were moved out, they were able to figure out what the inside of the Lemon House Tavern would have looked like during the days of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So if you visit today, it's been restored back to a tavern from the days of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, 1830s and 40s. So we have several period rooms. We have a bar room. There's a fancy parlor, dining room, and then there's an exhibit room in the back that talks about the history of the Lemon House, the Lemon family, some of the artifacts that were found during archaeology.
What ultimately put the railroad out of business?
While the Allegheny Portage Railroad and the Main Line Canal was the fast new way to travel when it opened, the Pennsylvania Railroad, with the completion of Horseshoe Curve in the 1850s, they are able to get across the state in one day. So again, there's a faster way to get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and you don't need the piecemeal system of the Main Line Canal anymore. So the Pennsylvania Railroad buys the right of way to the Main Line Canal, and they take control of that in 1857.
So, what becomes of the remnants of the railroad up to when the National Park Service enters the picture?
Once the Allegheny Portage Railroad closes, some of the rails are taken up and they are sent out west, and some of the materials are used to build other railroads. For the actual route of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, a lot of it follows local roads today, of roads being built on top of parts of where the railroad route once was. And we do have hiking trails on both ends of the railroad as well. One of our popular trails takes you to the Staple Bend Tunnel, and you're walking on what was called the long level. So you're walking on the path of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. There are several culverts you can view. You can walk through the Staple Bend Tunnel. And then on the eastern end of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, we have what is called the Incline 6 to 10 Trail. So it roughly follows the path of the Allegheny Portage Railroad down the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains. So trails on each end, and then a lot of what there is in the middle is local roads, or parts of it go through communities in the area.
How did the National Park Service become involved in preserving the remnants, especially the site at Summit?
Yeah, so in August of 1964, both the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site and Johnstown Flood National Memorial are designated as units of the National Park Service on the same legislation.
What is it about the site that led to it being recognized by the Department of the Interior so that it could become a National Historic Site?
So in our area, we had a local congressman who was very passionate about local history, and his name was John Murtha, and he was definitely instrumental in getting these sites to be part of the National Park Service.
Because you're looking at a piece of history in which, compared to what it was, very few remnants remain, the scope of it, how far back it is in history as well, how removed it is from the world we're in today, what are some of the challenges that are associated with interpreting the site?
One challenge is that when most people think of a railroad, they think of railroads as they are today. And so this was very different than modern railroads today with the inclined planes. So that's a challenge is how different this railroad is than ones we have today. How it functioned was different, how it operated was very different.
I had the fortune of visiting a few weeks ago, and for me, I was visiting on a day where I wasn't rushed. I had a lot of time to walk around and really read the signs to kind of understand how the machinery worked. And I think part of it, too, as I'm walking around, is just the fact that so much of it is trying to visualize this thing where we're fortunate to have the models of Fred Coniker, who we'll get to in a moment. When you think of trains, you're thinking of something that's moving, and obviously there isn't the infrastructure there for the cable inclined planes to still be working. So part of it too is trying to communicate about this moving piece of machinery, both a specific stationary steam engine and the larger machinations of the system, when all you have is just here's what's sedentary, here's what's stationary that remains today.
Yes, and how this piece, when you're walking along our historic area, when you're walking along the summit level, you're just looking at one piece of a much larger system. You're looking at one of 10 incline planes. Yeah, the whole thing was 36 miles. So trying to take this chunk and have people understand how it fits into the larger Allegheny Portage Railroad as a whole.
An important ally of solving this problem, it seems, is Fred Coniker. Who was he, and how would you say he was important to interpreting the site? What are some of the contributions that he made?
So Fred Coniker was a park volunteer, and he made a lot of contributions to Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. He built and helped restore a lot of the models that we have in our visitor center. He also, in our Engine House 6 exhibit shelter, has a model to scale of the machinery that would have been in all of the 10 engine house buildings, and all made by hand. He made it at his house and brought it to the park truckload by truckload. And it's absolutely amazing to think that he made all of that by hand. He was so talented. He had a passion for this park and its story, sharing the story of the Allegheny Portage Railroad with visitors. He also lived in the Lemon House at one point in his life, so it was interesting to hear about the history of that structure post railroad as well. So we're very grateful to Fred Coniker for all of his time and for sharing his passion and his talents at our site.
It's hard to believe when you see that life-size model that it is just a model, because it looks, based on everything that's been described, like the real thing. You stare at it and you could believe that it's the real thing that's there, when in reality, I gather, the only thing that remained that's original is the foundation. It's interesting, too, that the building that's constructed over it isn't original, and in fact, it's built in such a way that it is not resting on the original foundation. So it kind of has to hover over it with a steel skeleton, right?
Yeah, so the original engine house building um, was a bit smaller than our exhibit shelter is today. And as you said, that's because it's built to sit over the original foundation, part of it that's left. So prior to when the engine house exhibit shelter was built in the 90s, there was just the pit. So you had some of the foundation stones in the pit. So most of the machinery for the engine house buildings originally would have been in the pit. So he totally brought the engine house to life. And you're absolutely right. When you stand in there, it looks like you could turn on a switch and the whole thing would just start working. It's absolutely amazing. And visitors love to walk in there because it's almost like stepping back in time and seeing what it would have looked like then.
I like the complement of hands-on exhibits as well. So something that helped me to understand part of the machinery is the water braking. So if you had cars going down the plane, there was this system of water braking where you'd have a cylinder filled with water that was providing resistance. And to interpret that, you have a cylinder that visitors can grab a hand onto and pull and push and set the valve in different places to feel that resistance.
Yeah, and to also to see how the safety car would have worked and the different types of rope that were used to feel the difference between the hemp rope and the wire rope and the difference in size. Yeah, and as well with our um, new exhibits in the visitor center in the fall of 2019. Um, they are more interactive, they're hands-on. We have a replica of a canal boat that visitors can walk into and get a feel for what it would have been like to travel on a canal boat or to be the crew that lived on a canal boat. Children, we have an area where they can try on clothes from the time period, so that's very popular with the children trying on the clothes that they would have been wearing at that time.
Let's talk about that redesign because I was reading an article about it, and it's clear that this was a major project. What is the process for being able to bring about such an update from conception to completion?
It is definitely a multi-year process. The exhibits that we had in our current visitor center when it opened in 1992 were ones that were taken from the Lemon House and put up there. And so it was very exciting to get all new exhibits. So the Park Service and other Park Service groups and organizations, find photos and text and, what do we want to highlight in this space? And then, yeah, so it was a multi-year process. So we're very excited to have these new exhibits.
And I don't care what age you are, if you're a person who's willing to have fun, you look at the barrels that say, that hint at the type of cargo that would have been carried, and you open the flap and then you get to see the fish or the grain. There's a different element to that than just being told the inclined plane hauled fish, grain, and other commodities. It brings it to life in a different way.
Yeah, so the barrels and crates that show items that would have traveled on the Portage Railroad, you can peek inside, see what different designs on dishes, in the different types of foods, the fish, the apples, the flour, hams, bacon, all of that stuff. So it's fun to look inside and see what was actually carried on the Allegheny Portage Railroad.
Now, you may be listening to us talking and thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but what if I want a real train? What if I want to see a real locomotive? You're in luck because there's a life size model of a real life locomotive. I wondered if you could share the history behind the Lafayette.
So Lafayette is a model of a locomotive that would have been used on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The Lafayette model that we have in our visitor center on loan from the B&O Museum was actually built for the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s. So I always think of that in its original context and think how long ago it was built and how many people at the fair would have walked past that same model that you're looking at in the visitor center. And what a history.
I shared a photo of it online when I was gathering questions for this interview, and somebody commented on it and said, "That's a really tall smokestack." And you know what? They're right. It is really tall.
It is, and people often ask, they're like, how did you get this in here?
Carefully. Something that you mentioned earlier that I want to touch up a little more on. You mentioned the element of archaeology, and when I was looking through the Lemon House exhibits, they mentioned that as well. So the amount of original material that's original to the Lemon House is limited. And so it seems like what you've had to do is a process of learning what was there to be able to recreate a sense of that when you walk in. What is the process of archaeology when it comes to a site like that? And then how do you connect those dots of what's missing?
Because the Lemon House Tavern was used throughout many, many decades, once it becomes part of the National Park Service, there isn't a lot that's original from the days of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. A lot of items in the Lemon House are based off of other area taverns from that same time period because they would have likely had similar furnishings. There were studies that were done, subject matter experts who were able to determine that the fancy parlor had wallpaper, that the colors of the paint in some of the rooms, and they were able to determine based off of markings on the floor where the bar would have been in the bar room. And because there's not a lot that's original to the tavern from those days, you can come into the tavern, you can sit down at a table and pretend you were a traveler on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So you can walk around this space and take it all in. One of the original items that we have here is a portrait of Mrs. Lemon that would have hung in the Lemon House during the days of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and that was donated by the Lemon family to the park.
There are a lot of nice artifacts in there. I like how you've managed to bring it to life, given those limitations. It gives a better sense of how important this would have been as a staple of the nature of travel, just the nature of a tavern, even in general, even beyond taverns specific to this railway.
Yes, it would have been a very busy place with people coming and going all the time. Most people had very limited time in the Lemon House Tavern. So if you were traveling on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, unless you had a planned meal stop here, you had time to sit down, eat whatever Mrs. Lemon and staff prepared that day. There wasn't enough time for everyone to order something different. So you sat down, you ate your meal, and you were on their way. So just a constant flow of people coming in and out.
I do recommend that if you have a chance to visit, that you go on a weekday, especially when it may be less busy, because it's a type of site. I'm wondering if you would agree with this or not, Elizabeth, because you have far more experience being there than I do. I feel like it's a site that's really nice on a quiet day because then you could sort of fill in the mind with your imagination of what it would have looked like with the trains moving through, with people getting on and off at the tavern, to be able to really stare at the signs and wrap your head around how this machinery worked.
I agree. During the week, it's often not as busy as weekends, and you're right, you can almost stand on the summit level and feel as though you're back in time, and you can really get a sense of what the area would have looked like, because it looks very similar now with the original tavern and the engine house exhibit shelter. And what I love about working here is that a lot of people maybe haven't heard of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. We get folks who travel to national park sites and that's how they find us, or people who drive past and they see the sign, or they're visiting maybe another destination in the area, and sort of like you said, hey, oh, Allegheny Portage Railroad, like I want to stop there. And so it's awesome because we really get to share this story with visitors, because a lot of people don't either haven't heard of it, or if they have, they don't know a lot about the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So it's nice to talk with them, share stories, and see their excitement when they learn about this unique transportation system.
Something that you made me aware of is that when I reached out to you for an interview, you're like, oh, great, we're on the cusp of the 190th anniversary of the railroad. So we're recording this in February of 2024, and the 190th is in April. I'm curious if you have any specific special events lined up, as well as just other events that you have lined up throughout the year.
The Allegheny Portage Railroad anniversary is March 18th, 2024, and we will be having a special heritage hike. It's an anniversary hike to the Staple Bend Tunnel. So we always have an anniversary hike. It's not always to the Staple Bend Tunnel, it's on one of our trails throughout the park. So that's one way that we celebrate the anniversary of the Allegheny Portage Railroad opening. And not to worry, we have other hikes that take place throughout the summer months, and we do living history demonstrations. So throughout the summer, park staff are in period clothing, demonstrating different trades from the days of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So there's stone cutting, how they cut the stone sleepers, which were the foundations for the rails on the level sections, how they made the rope, which is awesome. So you can come visit, you can help a ranger make rope, and then you have a little souvenir to take home with you. Women talk about natural dyes and fabrics, spinning and weaving. So all of those take place during the summer months. Our park buildings are open daily from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Our trails and park grounds are open every day from sunrise to sunset. The only days that we are closed are Thanksgiving Day, Christmas Day, and New Year's Day.
It's a great thing to fit into your next visit to Horseshoe Curve.
Yes, we're very close to the Horseshoe Curve.
And you had me at Living History Day. I absolutely love historic interpretation days like that. So that sounds like fun.
Yes, it's so fun. Typically, in the summer we have an annual Living History Day, but if you visit the park throughout the summer months, June through September, there is usually a staff member available between 10 and 12 in the morning and 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And depending who's on staff and what program they do, you're still able to see those demonstrations throughout the summer.
That sounds like a lot of fun. My last question for you, Elizabeth. You already talked a little bit about what you love about working on site and interpreting the history. If you think back to when you were new and you were starting to learn this history, what was the thing that made you go wow or aha that you think really speaks volumes about the significance of the site and the history that it's working to interpret?
What always and still does amaze me is what these folks were able to do at the time that they were doing it. I think back even to the surveys over the Allegheny Mountains and how hard that would have been. And then to clear a path 120 feet wide, cutting down these giant trees just to make the path for the railroad, and then to build the railroad. And as I mentioned before, I always say to visitors to come up with this idea on paper and to say, yeah, I have an idea of how to make this work, but that they actually built it and made it work is truly amazing to me. It really is an engineering marvel of its time. And, they're just that they were able to conquer that great barrier of the Allegheny Mountains, and, that it was the final piece of the mainline canal, and now you can travel on this new system across the state of Pennsylvania.
If you want to see more of the site, I have a link in the show notes for this episode. If you search Allegheny Portage Railroad on the roundhousepodcast.com, if you're not listening there, I'll have a link to a video that shows my visit and some of what I got to see. It's a wonderfully preserved site. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse to talk about the history of this railroad and how you work to share that history with the public.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to have you all at the park and to talk to you in person. Thank you.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking with author Alexandra Kitty, who wrote A Different Track, Hospital Trains of the Second World War, about this overlooked history of hospital trains. And that led to the question, what is a piece of railroad history that is often overlooked? I read a lot of interesting responses online. First, from Andy Nichols on Facebook. As a native of Western PA, I'm sure you can relate to this. Anything in Western Pennsylvania, and especially Southwest Pennsylvania, the eastern side of the state is chock full of tourist lines and museum, but Western PA is practically barren. I agree, Andy. There's a lot of fascinating history in that area that I came to know because I lived there. And we'll touch on this theme of local railroads in a little bit. Joseph Robinson writes, the machines that made it all. It's great that the cars and engines and buildings get saved, but the machines don't. I agree, Joseph. I think that there's so much of a focus on the final product that we often overlook what it took to get to that final product. And so it makes places that have these machines preserved all that more valuable. Richard Colby writes, the female workers and workers who were more behind the scenes, not on the train crew or depot staff. Railroads were very deep industries with many parts not directly pictured with the train. Agreed, Richard. That's something that I feel like so many stories are lost to time because they weren't the glamorous jobs of railroading. And finally, from YouTube, Zeph Bet writes, one piece of railroad history that's often overlooked is railroads within a local area, specifically the steam era, whether short line, regional, logging, narrow gauge, etc. To me, they give aesthetic vibes, so to speak, in ways that represent railroads in a more slow, picturesque way, while in other cases, they show the perseverance of railroads working in tough environments like the rocky terrain, dangerous weather, or harsh desert. While many of these railroads' histories are well preserved in some form, like the Buffalo Creek and Gawley or West Side Lumber Company, others aren't so lucky, either barely preserved or haven't been preserved at all, or have struggled to keep their history strong and preservation in some fashion. Zeph, I definitely agree with that. One of my favorite railroads that I've probably mentioned here from time to time is the Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville Railroad of upstate New York, which I came to discover because of a train simulator recreation of the line. And I think there's so many railroads like that that don't see the light of day because there's not a lot of published work on them, or they're really only known to that area. But there's so many fascinating quirks and stories to them that deserve a larger audience. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is an underrated technological marvel in railroading? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Guys, it's always a pleasure to have you along for these journeys. Remember that the Roundhouse is our house.